I work as a program manager at an organization called the Centre for Public Impact, working as a learning partner, helping different organizations in different places across the UK think about what HLS approaches might mean for them in their context and building them in their context, including working with some organizations that are really looking at the kind of community organization and community development piece. And it's an area of huge interest for me. So I'm really excited to be here and excited to discuss this with you. I'll be hosting and helping to facilitate the session with our speakers, and we'll start off with some introductions and some reflections, but then we'll be taking your questions from the chat. So please do share your kind of reflections and questions on the chat as we go, and we will try and get around as many of those as we can during this session. But first, I wanted to ask our speakers today to introduce themselves. So, John, are you happy to start with a quick introduction of who you are and your organisation?
Yeah, I'll just spend 5 minutes doing so, if that's right. I'll start with my description of myself, which is I'm a white male in their 30s, and I'm wearing the uniform of people in the community sector, which is a crumpled shirt and jeans. That's my understanding. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm from an organisation called Community Renewal Trust, and we have a particular programme relevant to system change where we got hooked up by the Lottery Fund, in fact, with some of the HLS thinkers called Community Renewal Lifting Neighbourhoods Together. And I'm not going to try to introduce the whole of what we do, but very briefly, we've managed to make an organisation, hopefully you can see my screen, we've managed to make an organisation which only has 50 or 60 staff into something very complicated by splitting it up in order to give individual communities more power. There's 4 major elements where we're in Community Renewal Pennywell, it's in Edinburgh. The Lifting Neighbourhoods Together team is in a neighbourhood called Bingham. These are all deprived neighbourhoods in Edinburgh. Community Renewal Roma is Scotland's community development trust for Roma population and is based in Glasgow. And we also have a social enterprise funeral directors on the side, do consultancy and training. We've been going for 20 years, and I summarize our approach. You can tell I'm trying to do this in 5 minutes because I've clearly squeezed 2 slides together here. The bit on the left says what our approach is. We really bang on about this a lot, about listening, connecting, building on people's strengths, and sticking with people as long as it takes. And we've done that over what we call 4 learning cycles, each of which kind of builds on the last and goes onwards. We start as an organization just looking at how you could take community development approaches and apply it to securing work and income for people. Moved on to how it could be relevant to health promotion and improving health and well-being. We started getting money for actual investment and visioning in communities to undertake more formal community development. And this latest bit of work is really about integrating. So how do we kind of build on each of these waves of learning cycles, to mix my metaphors horribly? The conundrum we feel is faced, that we're trying to tackle particularly through our system change work at the minute, are these, and I'll not read them, there's nothing worse than someone reading out what's on the screen, but basically we think public services are fundamentally broken. And so you can imagine that we share a lot of the ethos of HLS around some change is needed, and we need different ways of thinking about it. In particular, this issue of people going from place to place where people are getting a linear service based around being fixed, and they get assessed every time around all their needs. And that's not targeted in a systematic or preventative way, nor with sufficient equity based on how people's needs. Like, we work in deprived neighborhoods, you could have 10 times the investment there and it'd still be not nearly enough to actually make a significant difference to those places as well as the people. So that, as I say, about a third of the work we do is actually this Lifting Neighbourhoods Together program, and there's a number of partners involved in delivering it with us, including our replication trial. So at the same time that we're doing a 5-year trial in this £2 million program, Building Futures East are replicating what we're doing in Newcastle independently of us with our guidance to see what we've learned and whether that's their learning is sort of akin to ours or they have completely different experience. Broadly, this is going to sound extremely obvious to people working in the community sector in particular, but broadly the idea is to take a systematic approach. So we're trying to be systematic about partners we engage, building community capacity, but then adding that to this one-to-one support work that can actually lift people and a whole community potentially out of poverty is the broad aim. So can we engage people systematically through community events, through door knocking, and we knock on thousands and thousands of doors, and then take a whole person approach to every person we support, even if they're not currently in crisis. And the key to it for us is the idea that instead of employing a group of like, we work on neighborhoods about 5,000 to 10,000 people. You could employ 15 new members of staff who are all eager and like, yeah, let's do that work. And instead, we've taken the extremely hard and somewhat regretful route of instead seconding people in who have other jobs and saying, why don't you do your job in this paradigm instead? It's a huge psychological change for people. And it's about bringing together a group of people who maybe didn't start with the same views and have all sorts of KPIs and other things going on, and taking 5 years to try to get them in order. That program started in February 2020. And you can imagine the first 2 years were a bit of a disaster because COVID. But we're here now and we're learning lots about it at the minute. Anyway, that's a potted introduction to myself, if that's right.
Thanks, John. That's really helpful. Matt, do you want to go next?
Okay, I've just got to find the share screen button. Okay, so I just wanted, similar to John, kind of do a quick run through. So I'm Matt from Plymouth Octopus. I lead the charity, and I'm joined by Karen, who's going to take on and actually be a lot more helpful than I am in terms of understanding perhaps how this translates into community. So just a little bit about POP. So we're a grassroots organization in terms of building the community expression of kind of change, linking them together, supporting them to be more effective. We see grassroots as being one of those expressions of how people come together to create the change that they want to see in their community, whether that's, you know, a small sports group because that's what they want to see in their immediate environment, or larger scale change in terms of social justice. As an organization, we try to be really values led and purpose led in what we do. So we're a bit of a stickler for really holding on to relationships and collaboration, and everything that is needed to make that work really well, because what we see around us is perhaps that doesn't happen quite as much as it could for lots of different reasons. We deliver 6 key work streams. We've got our kind of core of kind of network building, relationship building between grassroots groups, wider VCSE and the statutory sector. We've got the capacity building, so supporting those grassroots groups to win funding, work together, be effective in themselves. Communications in terms of information going out. We also deploy grants into the grassroots sector, and it's one of the areas where we're perhaps most challenged to try and be values led. So we've got to make decisions about grant funding, but we're trying to be led by collaboration and relationship building, and that can be a really tricky balance to get right. And then in terms of that kind of citywide strategic stuff, we look at, well, how do we knit all the kind of different relationships and different moving parts together so that we can get the change that we want to see across at a city level, and currently leading on quite a large bit of work around social isolation and loneliness and co-design in that. And then we've got a program of work that is working with people in community back into work, and similar to John, trying to do that in a way that is actually building out from people themselves. They're not quite as ambitious as the work that John's doing, so we're suitably inspired, and we're quite small, so don't imagine that there's a big team behind this. There's like 8-9 people. Okay, just a bit about me. So my dad and stepdad enjoy a bit of kind of swimming, cycling and running. That's a bit of a kind of new thing. I guess it kind of hits you when you're kind of in your 40s, and yeah, and looking to the future. I trained as an engineer. I've worked in the voluntary community sector for over 15 years. I stepped out, worked in and around health for a bit. And from very early on, I was kind of recognizing actually what we're working in is a different environment to the one that we seem to plan for. So a bit about that. So Human Learning Systems kind of feels like a natural next step. The stuff that we're doing at the minute isn't really working, and that's not because we set out to do something wrong. Actually, you know, improving services, making better use of money, all the kind of drives that drive us to be where we are right now are absolutely legitimate drives. But what I feel is that we've forgot to learn, and we've forgot to actually observe. It's a bit like I was having a conversation with someone the other day about performance-related pay. You know, clearly it's something that doesn't work, but yet he's in a company that is still trying to kind of implement and put that into place. So there's something that kind of gets in the way of actually us observing the real change that's happening to us. And just to kind of quickly go, you know, it was back in 2004, working on my master's. I found some essays that I wrote the other day, and I was saying the same things. That's kind of slightly depressing because stuff I've not changed, but also it just shows the timescales that it takes to kind of create some of this change. So yeah. Now I'll finish and hand over to Karen soon. I think in community, human learning systems doesn't quite make as much sense as it does in public services. And that's because it's not acting against something. So in public services, HLS is an alternative to new public management. It can be framed in that way. In community, it's not framed against a shift from something to something else. I don't think, but that's what I'd like to kind of talk through. I come into this kind of actually not really knowing what HLS means in community. So the best I can get right now is it's human. We need to listen to one another. Learning, we kind of need to problem solve one another with one another. And systems means that just lift your view and be aware of others around you, just to try and kind of simplify it. So that's just a bit more information, and worth noting that we also work with Torbay to try and kind of put this practice across the rest of the UK. Right. Okay, so I will stop there and hand over to Karen.
Hi, so I met Matt about 5 or 6 years ago, I think now. So I've been interested in community stuff, I suppose, in the city of Plymouth for ages, starting off as a kind of journalist, and then got involved in a community association because that's where I live. I live here. So and we are a quite a deprived neighborhood, I guess, in Plymouth. So we are the 3rd most deprived in the city, but we kind of join on to one that's like the 16th most deprived in the city. So there's quite a wide sort of demographic really in our area. So Matt and I probably haven't really talked a little bit, because I sort of feel that community does have quite a thing to kick against. I think we were quite clear. So we started to really formalize properly during the pandemic. We did a load of mutual aid. We felt like we wanted a space on our high street. So there was an empty, broken down shop, been empty for over 5 years. So we kind of moved in rent free, and then just had a space where we hotspotted, and kind of, we didn't have electric, we didn't have lights, but we hotspotted, and we kind of like basically accosted people as they were going up and down the high street to say, hi, we're a community, you might not know this. And so that's kind of how we started, but we were really clear about what we didn't want to do. So I'd had a background in a quite a hierarchical sort of corporation, like a small family business really, and I'd been said no to in ways that I really didn't want to say no to other people. So that was quite conscious in our thinking. We also had a small charity in our area that was had been really tightly controlled by kind of its trustees, and those trustees had become quite elderly, and they were you know, maybe a little bit out of touch, but were hanging on for grim death in terms of like what they had to do to keep the charity going. But that was kind of counterproductive really for some things that the rest of the community felt that they may like to do. So there were lots of kind of established ways of doing things, and we had a bit of intervention about kind of almost 20 years ago now, and there was a huge amount of development and kind of big planters and a road system that was put into place, but 20 years on, the people that were involved in that had gone, the jobs had closed down, the planters were full of brambles, and the community felt as like unsupported as ever, really. Yeah, so there were loads of things that we didn't want to do, so we didn't really know quite what we wanted to do, but what we said was we wanted to do things with, not for people. That was our kind of strap line. And I suppose, so we constituted as a community benefit society in December 2020, so we're pretty young at this, but I suppose that's been our passion consistently. How do we do things with, not for people? How do we stop this being like a community of a few? God help us, how do we stop, you know, us being those trustees that kind of control the situation in our 80s and go, no, you can't do this. It's like, it's not what we did in the past. And how do we support people in our area who don't even know they have a voice sometimes, really, or who do struggle maybe with you know, lack of self-esteem, lack of self-worth, not quite sure how to do things, but are, you know, incredibly intelligent, massively informative people with a whole load of ideas and passions and strengths, and how do we work with all of us to create something better in our area? So that's me.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks, Matt, as well. Really interesting food for thought in all of those introductions, and certainly seeing some themes across. So kind of questions about how you know, what does community development have to push against? Is it the same as in public services? Probably not quite, but there are some similarities around hierarchy, decision making, how that all happens. So some really interesting food for thought there. And thanks to everyone who's been introducing themselves in the chat and sharing their reflections. I'm really enjoying hearing a lot of those, and please keep them coming. So please keep kind of reflections and any questions coming. We will kind of get to as many of those during the course of this hour as we possibly can. But to kick us off and to kick off the conversation, I just want to ask a really open question to all our speakers about, what does HLS mean to you, and what do you think about that in the context of community? I know you've started to answer that a little bit in your introductions, but I'd really be keen to hear your kind of broader reflections on that question. So, John, do you want to kick us off in terms of that question?
Yeah, I'm really excited by HLS because it gives us a framework to have a discussion about that's not the traditional stuff. You know, and I actually think that can be both ways. It can be for people who have no framework to say, are we learning and are we doing anything? Are we just, you know, blindly walking forward? Or people who are so rigorously thinking they're caught up on particular KPI driven model that they're all sorted. So it kind of give a bit of chat either way there. I'm not entirely sure I agree with Matt's point there. But I came across HLS about 3 years ago or so. Got really excited, started to try to do something about it, and then promptly took a very long period of parental absence. So I really shot myself in the foot for having momentum, basically, and only lately have I picked up on it. So, you know, apologies if you picked the wrong speakers, but I feel extremely naive and inexperienced around HLS in many ways. And broadly, that's because, you know, it speaks to me, and I can understand what we're talking about. You know, I then am like, oh, I'll sit in private and say, what's my role as a system steward here? And that word really sits with me, and it makes sense. And as soon as I open my mouth to talk to my colleagues about it, I realize I could be talking complete gibberish to them. And it's really, really, you know, the bit where I then need to be in a kind of training mode and gaining their buy-in from it is where I'm starting to fall down a little bit. So, and that's in all sorts of ways. But as you maybe heard in my introduction, we're an organization that does lots of, we actually do public service driven things. You know, just to stick with my example, talking about our work with the Roma people, you know, I was really proud that we've got some, unbelievably, we've got some European Social Fund money, which is like the worst, most horrible money you could have. But we've got it delivered by, exclusive by a team of Roma people. It just doesn't happen normally. If you say, I mean, it just wouldn't happen. But actually that Community Development Trust's biggest achievement this year has nothing to do with that employability program at all. They got 3 park benches installed in the local park. And honestly, it's the biggest thing that community could have. They're so delighted. It's such a massive change. It took 2 years in which we were told that if you install 3 park benches, it'll almost certainly fall into a mine shaft underneath. That definitely wasn't there when the white community were asking for park benches. So it was really fascinating experience, and that's been like the sum of it. So we've got this interesting bridge of like, we are delivering public services that are very heavily compliance based. And then we've got this community development, you know, grassroots stuff as well in one place. So I kind of need to deal with both halves of that. But yeah, it speaks to me really, my summary is it speaks to me really deeply. And I personally, it really resonates with me. I'm not saying everything in it is perfect from my perspective. If you say, I mean, I'm actually an enthusiast for things like appropriately set up randomized control trials as well. It's worth saying, you know, there's different ways that I think can be done. But as an alternative to doing nothing, and as an alternative to the KPI-driven and compliance-driven approach that I see everywhere, just really resonates with me. But I'm really at the stage of saying, sort of struggling to bring others along the route with me, if you see what I mean. I have boards of people who are community members. How do I speak to them about this? You know, what that anyway, so that's where I'm up to in my journey. But I remain inspired, I think is the word.
That's brilliant. Thanks, John. I think, yeah, lots of questions in there about kind of articulating HLS in different contexts, as well as sort of, yeah, building the bridge between the NPM of some parts of the system and ways that other parts of the system are working. Yeah, really interesting reflections. Karen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I guess I think I'm just really interested in the acceptance that all of our systems aren't working very well. I think that's kind of, you don't need to be, you know, particularly academic or really deeply into those systems to say, you know what, they just aren't working. So I think that's kind of like really front and central. And everybody we talk to, like, whether they're in health or statutory services or, you know, the community by itself is just saying, you know what, it's just not working. So I think there's a massive, like, what next? You know, there's a huge, is there a way we could do things differently? And I think in our culture, we've not really learned, because we've had the welfare state in place, we've not really learned from how people do communities very well. And I think what's happened is we've tended to become very isolated, very individually thinking, and not necessarily connected up within the neighborhoods that we belong to, because we don't really belong to them in a sense. We're kind of transitory. And I think the pandemic really kind of shook something on that process. And so what I think HLS would mean to me then is how we can be more human and more thoughtful. I think it's massively important to slow down. I think the whole capitalist nature of like driving things at breakneck speed and exhausting everybody is something that we can really do something differently in community. And like John says, I mean, we have projects like within our local park to do with taking down toilet blocks, and it just takes forever. It's just so slow. But actually, we're starting to embrace that now and say, you know what, we're not going to try and run before we walk. We're only going to walk. And the way to bring people together is kind of, you know, slow. You're repeating things again and again and again and again, and you're building up slowly. And actually, that's what people start to connect to. Yeah, people aren't supposed to just get it, you know, and I think some of our issues, if we start saying things like HLS and using an acronym and all this kind of thing, people just go, what the beep are you talking about, really? Yeah, so we've got to, I think from our point of view in community, we've just got to kind of get ourselves into language where people can understand what we're talking about, and then start to drip feed that, you know, there could be a different system, there could be something else going on.
Yeah, Yeah, really interesting. So yeah, something about changing the pace at which we try to do some of these things and thinking about language for sure.
Do you mind if I just sorry, Ruth, but Karen's point is I've just become involved in a bit of work. I can't really talk too much about, where we support people with community visioning, and I would never normally particularly get excited by it, but the suggestion is they want to build up a community vision for a rural community which will last 8 generations.
Wow.
And I was like, you know what, this is worth getting out of bed for. Yeah, I'm absolutely on board. I don't know what on earth that looks like. There's questions there that are completely unfathomable, but I can tell you now, it doesn't base around us in 2022 coming up with KPIs that they can measure in, I can't even say 21, 22, like, you need to take a different approach. And I know that's an extreme example, but I think finding these places where people are saying, actually, is it about next week having an answer that a minister can reply to, or the councillors can feel reassured of, or is it about setting in motion things that will look after themselves for decades?
Yeah, brilliant.
So I think one of the dangers with human learning systems is so I guess I'm hearing almost community being framed in the context of public services. And for me, community is in itself a thing. And so I think that's one of the dangers, is that we try and frame community in the context of public services and targets and metrics and so on. Community doesn't live by targets and metrics anyway. So why would we even talk about targets and metrics in that setting? We wouldn't. So there's a bit about, actually, when we talk about human learning systems in the context of community, let's put the public systems to one side, because that's not the start point. The start point, I think, is something about, well, let's observe how people come together anyway. Like, how do people come together? How does that local knitting group start? How does, without anybody's input, without anybody kind of saying, oh, this is what should happen, that stuff happens organically all the time. Now, we want more of it to happen organically more of the time. And for that to happen, we do need to think about the resources that we put into that. But that stuff is happening. So what is taking it to happen? And I think if we're observing it, then people naturally come around areas of interest and purpose. We want to kind of do this together. We want to kind of share this together. So the central part of human learning systems, which is about convening around purpose, is naturally held. So we don't have to talk about kind of convening around purpose, because people are doing it. What we can do is, actually, I think we can use human learning systems to maybe recognize it and say, oh, look, actually, you're doing it naturally. And then I think there's a rigor that you can then bring to that, to go, okay, now we were recognizing it, how can we do it even better? Because on the flip side of it happening organically is it happens organically but unconsciously. So we do see where community activities become so focused in and around one person that when that one person leaves or something happens, it completely collapses. And there's a kind of black hole of kind of activity because one person. So how can we kind of improve the practice of community, but building from the natural stuff that is already happening? There is all, if somebody's setting up a group, there is going to be a really natural learning cycle. You're going to kind of, because your metric is anyone turning up, or there are people that I want to kind of turning up, is the stuff happening that I'd like to see happening. And so naturally you're going to get a bit of, well, actually that didn't work, so what can I do to kind of shift and change that? So again, because if you kind of put it in the context of public services, we don't learn not because we're naturally bad at learning, but because of the frames and the structures around prevent that learning. In community, those frames and structures don't exist. So So actually it does happen naturally, but I think what HLS can do in the context of community is hone and develop and kind of think about, well, okay, how can we make that even better? So how do we work in groups? How do we organize ourselves? And that's why I get most excited about community, because it's unfettered by the public service thinking. It's just fettered by human nature. and that gets us much closer to the heart of some of these issues than I think, you know, working in public service settings.
I think Matt's making a really important point about communities naturally ending up having a role in lots of areas that instead are led by public services. It is absolutely independent, but you know, one of the reasons I awkwardly talk about things like this ESF program is, you know, public services think there's a gap, if you see what I mean. They think, oh, well, we'll give a small amount of money to community stuff because that's kind of over there and we don't really understand. And then let's give a much larger amount of money to some mental health interventions. Let's give an intervention for a particular type of person. Let's make sure this GP has more. There's all these kind of different levels of intervention that come in and swoop into an area. And actually, the vast majority of it could be done through community mobilized capacity building. But because it's often that, you know, there's no discussion about saying, well, they take ownership of this, because there's maybe a resistance to being involved a little bit in some of these areas. And there's no framework by which you say, well, you know what, actually, if you think about it, the like youth groups that we've been running have ended up giving more youth experience to more people who've then gone on to get decent jobs out of this than anything else. You know, that your citywide program around youth employability is nothing compared to what we've just done through our, you know, volunteering schemes and things. So I think being able to have language that says, whoa, whoa, whoa there, public services, we are independent of you, but we can do your areas, you know, we can do your work, and we're not going to report back to you on headcounts and, you know, how you went from a 4.2 on a 6.3 on a scale of 1 to 10 on some made up scale. What we are going to do is just like demonstrate that over time this community gets this neighborhood. I always talk about neighborhoods when I'm talking about communities, unfortunately. Improves, you know, and it's not improved by people leaving and new people coming in. It's improved because the same group of people are invested in their community and love their knitting group. I think one of the issues Matt brings up is the learning cycles for some community work. And my example would be a knitting group. And I'm certainly not going to be dismissive of this, but we need to be careful around some of the language about learning, because you might convene a knitting group and it might be obvious to us as staff or mobilizers or, like, you know, even the key volunteers, oh, we should change this in some way. But actually that can be a problem if you're something, because that group might not want to change if you're something. Then you might be like, look, oh, what we've learned is that this could be done much better, and couldn't this be like this, and couldn't this be like this, and if only we did this. And actually you often have to just let it be, if you see what I mean. You just have to say, well, yeah, no, actually it's important that that group meets, and introducing the tension of change to a settled will of a community group can be contentious and difficult. It's not impossible. But I think that does introduce a factor in the learning bit. You know, it's absolutely, we can still get on with the human bit. Are we treating that group as humans? Are we actually building relationships with them? We're just having natural, you know, honest discussions with them. Yeah. Is it system-wide? Yeah, it can be. You can get into those discussions. That learning bit can be tough on that front, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're having quite a lot of discussion in the chat on a number of different fronts. There are a few different questions that are coming up for people. One of the ones that has come up is about potential power dynamics within communities themselves. I think there was a particular question about actually how some community groups can be paternalistic in their approach, or actually can be oppressive in themselves, or marginalizing certain groups, or contributing to the marginalization of certain groups. And what role HLS might have in that discussion and debate, but also kind of broader thinking and reflections on that discussion and debate, where actually we might sometimes kind of over talk about the positive sides of community groups and community-led things, but actually there can be sometimes a shadow side. I know, Karen, you picked this up earlier in what you were saying. I don't know if you want to expand on that, and then I'll extend it to the other two as well.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think the amount of community work we see just like shackled to the local stallion sometimes. So people start with really good intentions, then it becomes their baby and they get really kind of like emotionally involved, and then you get like a bit of a dictator, really, don't you? And I think we've all probably seen that a lot, which is like our political system, really. If you think about it, it is no difference. And to be fair to people who live, if you're not shown a better example, that is the way you're going to act. So you're going to have really strong power, you know, power things that are happening in your life, and you are going to kind of wheel and deal on the side to get your point of view across and get what you want to happen, definitely. So I think we are super aware of that. We're super aware of holding space for people. We're super aware of holding whatever views people have to come in when we meet. We have lots and lots and lots of little different micro groups. We have a few values, I think, which kind of talk about, you know, being kind and respectful to anybody who comes in, regardless of their point of view, not to, we have loads of we've got quite a few in our community who are not white, who experience kind of, you know, those kind of undercurrent racist comments like on a daily basis. So what do we do as a community about that? When somebody says to somebody, the wee girl, because they're from Singapore, yes, so they're like small and structured, you know, despite the fact that they're 40, or if somebody says, you know, that black person, and it's like the same person morphed into like 3 people, really. Yeah, so you know, that definitely happens all the time, and it's uncomfortable to sit in. But I guess what we are, if we're committed to try and make a community that's a safe place for everybody within the community, then I think we're working on dealing with those things on a case-by-case basis. We're learning what to do when we disagree, and I think we're learning what to do when we're criticized, either from like the inside out or from the outside into us, really. Yeah, we're learning, you know, we all get things wrong, and there are no experts, really, and the people who are paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to make the stuff work haven't really made it work anyway. So we can afford to be a little bit flamboyant about our failures, really, and about the things that we don't know very well. And I guess that fits into learning, I think, really, that we're not trying to say, hey, look at us, we're super cool and trendy, we know what we're doing. Yeah, because we really don't.
I think the person making this comment is onto something. If you see, I mean, there are some tensions in this place. I think part of it is around the H in HLS, right? So I think all of us think that what humans are always deeply compassionate and desperate to build trusting relationships. That's not always the case, if you see what I mean. It's actually a human foible that's not the case. You know, there are cases where people, and it's not necessarily about a personality thing, but there's times and places in people's lives or social circles where people are like, no, my view is going to be more important here, and I can't see anyone else's, or I'm going to plow through something. I think it's a natural human instinct sometimes to come up with paternalistic services. You know, if you get a group of people in, this is certainly not limited to faith things, but there's a lot of experience of, you know, faith groups trying to be really well-meaning in their community services and becoming very paternalistic. Again, it's not limited to them. I've come across quite a lot of examples of that, and you kind of have to push back a little bit about it. And I think it's just because that's a human thing to do, you know. So ironically, I think in the H bit, we maybe need to be more accommodating in the fact that we're all a bit broken, all of us, and in different circumstances we act in different ways. But we're not all this like fantastic, you know, always very lefty, liberal, all about like compassion and things. Kindness can be expressed in other ways. Kindness for some people is about being like, you know, for my family and my place, I'm going to damn well manage to get them a good life, despite the fact that my neighborhood's awful around me. I'm going to protect them. And that can really butt against our kind of non-judgmental approaches. So I think the human bit sometimes, I think since I started looking at HLS a few years ago, I think we've gone a long way towards fleshing out the learning side of it. I think it's much clearer to me how that could be a structured framework and meetings and things. feel like it's maybe time to go back to that H bit and say, well, what does that mean, and how can we do more? And I think once that's addressed, maybe that it can speak better to the community sector.
So I think Nick's point is central to the work that needs to be done, and I think that's why I get most excited about the community aspect of it, because I think when we're in public services, you lose that because you just blame it on, oh, the structures are wrong or the way of working is wrong in an organization. But just as John has said, we're all a bit shit sometimes, and we're all a bit lovely sometimes. And it's acknowledging the crapness that we all carry, and still being able to work with it. So yesterday I was on a workshop that was being led by I've forgotten her name, Dr. Lucy somebody, on the power threat meaning framework, which is a new framework when thinking about mental health issues. She's got a much better way of putting it, and there's something really quite powerful in that, because it's using narratives to just ask, is that a helpful framing of my life and what have I experienced? So is it helpful to kind of see myself fixed in this psychosis diagnosis, or is it more helpful to reframe? Yes, Lucy Johnson, thank you. Or is it helpful to see my experiences framed as experiences and my natural kind of responses to that? And I think some of that practice can then be translated into the community setting, because so I guess I'm a glass half full on people's behavior. I don't think people go out to piss one another off. I think actually we're all looking for connection. It's one of our fundamental, most important things that we look for. But you can see in lots of behaviors, like personally, you know, when I feel like I want to connect most, I get angry and piss people off. Like, how does that make sense? And it's because sometimes our wiring and our experiences have shifted our behaviors to be completely against what we're actually looking for. So as individuals, we all carry some of that stuff. And so working and being honest about that in community, I think, gets us much closer to the important conversation. And it's not harking back to, oh, communities of old were lovely places. No, they were pretty racist, they were pretty homophobic, and actually we're kind of trying to seek a forward direction. And HLS could develop some kind of expression of what that might mean.
I have a rule of thumb I sometimes use with people, and I've heard Michael Marmot a few times say, you know, one way of trying to move towards a kind of more Marmot-y society, sure, it doesn't say that, is if every decision we make, we think, you know, how does this sit with inequality? And I often challenge people in this space to say, look, I work with lots of Roma people. They often don't have settled status, but they also have a whole different like ethos around inclusion and what it means to be inclusive. And you know, often their family lives are different. They sometimes bring different cultural baggage, whether it's around discomfort with other races and things like that. So I often say, look, if your plan, so you know, what you plan to do something with GPs where you improve it in some way, if your plan will work for the Roma community, you can be pretty sure that it's a pro-Marmot thing. You know, it really will improve health inequalities. What about with other gypsy travelers? Would your plan work there? So when people say things like, oh, I've come up with a plan for how we could improve like food poverty issues or something like that, I would say, well, look, how would that work with a transient population or a population with different culture? And if you can't answer that question, then probably your suggestion is bogged down in the sort of problems that lead to greater health inequalities. And it's only because it's a marginal case. You know, it's like, it's extremely hard to come up with any proposition. And when you're doing HLS, you know, you say, what's my idea? Let's go and test it. It's really hard to come up with any proposition which you genuinely, a heart of hearts think, yeah, that'll definitely work better or as well for those populations as it will for anyone else. And I just find it a useful prompt a few something, because it does bring all of that community baggage, like people coming at it from a different angle, people who don't share our kind of paradigm of thinking, our friendship groups and our professional circles, people who are coming at it from a very different angle. Now, I find that helps us try to direct what we do. You know, would that work for that group of people? Almost all your ideas go in the bin when you start asking that question.
Really interesting reflections. Thank you, everyone. And thanks for those who are continuing to add to the chat. There's a really interesting discussion going on there as well. Just to pick up on some other questions that we've had, a lot of people were asking about that interaction between community and public services, and recognizing the power that exists in community, but also recognizing that there's a formal sort of power around public services, and how can that be shared and transitioned, with some particular questions around funding and how funding for community development tends to come through a very new public management sort of mechanism. And have any of you seen or experimented with or imagined other mechanisms that could be more helpful in terms of supporting this kind of work? I
think we live in two places in the country where there are quite a lot of experiments around this. Like it happens that if you take a map, I think Plymouth and Edinburgh have both done more in this space than most places. In Edinburgh, you know, there's been a few rounds of money where they've tried to do something called community commissioning, which was interesting. And there's also a model in Scotland called public social partnerships, but it's about a different approach to commissioning. And it's been really interesting. And I think what's interesting is it's so much better than a competitive process. And in some ways, I have to say, in all the cases, they've lucked out that there's not been much competition for the money, if you're selling. The community commissioning model, almost no one got, like 99% of people got the money they asked for. So it worked out very well. And I thought that was better. Basically, it was better than competition, but it was kind of worse than anything else. It ended up bringing a whole new set of questions, but that's great because an HLS approach should be like, oh God, like what do we learn from that and how do we go from there? So it was learning by doing. And broadly in both cases, it ended up being a little bit like, we just found a person who would become the gatekeeper, but that person who was the gatekeeper to all the money shared our values. And that's not a sustainable plan. You can't do that. You can't roll that out or scale it up because you can't find that person. But at least it's better than the alternative, if that makes sense. So at least we're on the path to learning something. So there's definitely interesting things going on in Edinburgh. But I know Plymouth's the same.
Yeah, Matt.
Oh, right. Yeah, you were. Thanks, Aaron. On the question of funding, I could take the rest of the time up. So I'll just say that we're doing some interesting kind of stuff to try and not be reliant on that person, but set up the kind of decision-making structures so that it's more of a inbuilt kind of collaborative and participative process. And participatory grant making is obviously in that mix. I guess I heard the question as like, how do we fund this work? I'm really aware of the work in Torbay. That was lucky enough to kind of get lottery funding. I'm sure there were targets, I'm sure there were metrics kind of involved in that, but it wasn't necessarily led by that kind of way of viewing it. I don't think there are many examples. I think when you kind of start to kind of think about money coming from public services, which is generally where it would come from for this type of work, you end up having to kind of do the balance, a bit of kind of playing the game, and at the same time kind of trying to protect the work from being too skewed by that. I think there's also a challenge, and this is where by kind of trying to do it differently is really helpful, because if you hold the kind of, well, of course we need to kind of show what's happening. We need to kind of know that it's achieving the things that we want it to achieve. Otherwise, there is no point in kind of doing this. So, we're making a huge assumption about community development works. Well, how do we know? What kind of basis are we kind of making that assumption? because I don't think there's many examples that show that, you know, there's been systemic transformation as a result of kind of doing community development. So so I think that that kind of pressure to be conscious about what you're doing has been a really helpful one over the last kind of few decades. But the tools by which we show that change, I'm not sure if they are there, which I think they are, we're not confident that they're giving us the evidence in the form that we kind of feel confident in. So yeah, it doesn't really answer your question.
What's your view on participatory budgeting, Matt? I can see someone, I was aware that might be the context, and I can see someone talking about it. What's your view on it?
So participatory budgeting at a kind of local authority level, I'm not fully convinced. Participatory grant making and budgeting, for me, it's about the distance between decision making and action and the people that are being impacted. So participatory budgeting is often a panel of people. Well, if that panel of the people are the people that are going to be impacted, then great. If the panel of people are just holding power in the same way that the traditional structures would hold power, but in a slightly different, slightly nicer looking way, I still think you get the same problems that are kind of across the board. Like, how do you make judgment between one project and another project based on arbitrary criteria that you will inevitably get game playing around? You know, you can't have an expertise pot. So I think, but there is no good answer to that. I don't think, and it's choosing the best tool for the job, I think.
Aaron, did you want to comment on that as well?
Just you know, I mean, obviously universal basic income is a really interesting thing. Just wondering about, we do a lot of stuff for free, and some of that obviously is challenging, but some of that is almost like counter system, because you think, well, if you completely opt out of the system and just say you're going to do it anyway, does that give you greater freedom to do some of the stuff that you want to do or not? And I know it's challenging. We pay everybody part-time, we pay everybody the same amount of money. The reasons we try and have more part-time people than full-time people is that we're trying to constantly like sort of spread it out a little bit. And then that means that most of us have had to get other jobs. So there's like a kind of tension in that as well. But that seems more true to what community is all about, really, because it's not true that you get a full-time job doing community stuff, actually, and so that seems to be more representative of the people that we live here. But also I'm super aware that's hugely challenging, and you know, and it's really difficult for people who are trying to pay bills and have children and blah blah blah, and so I think there are possible other things to add into the mix of it if you're talking about real human learning things that make it very different to statutory services, that if we were a little bit more daring about sometimes might kind of challenge the status quo. And I think for us, the most exciting things come out of that space sometimes, when people just go, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway, because that feels like an incredible, you want to go, yay. Well done.
Absolutely. I think I'm conscious that we haven't got to some of the questions in the chat, and we are running out of time in our hour, which is really sad. We could certainly go on for much longer with this conversation, but I think I would really like to invite all our speakers to reflect, just as a sort of rounding up, what are some of the kind of a couple of key points or things that you've learned, things that have surprised you, or things that you're taking away from this conversation? And I'd also invite people in the chat to reflect on that as well. I think for me, Some of the things that this has really sparked for me are around thinking about the human in human learning systems, and returning to kind of building out what that might mean, what that means in the context of community, what that means for power dynamics in the community, and also thinking about how we can be more creative in the way that community development then links into public services. It's not just about funding, it's about how they can learn from each other, and lots of really interesting reflections shared on that. But yeah, I'll also invite our speakers to share what they have taken from this conversation. Matt, do you want to kick off?
I like to kind of like mull things over before. I think so. I think it's given me more hope that human learning systems can be applied within community. I think that there is, and it really does kind of end up focusing down on that kind of human bit. What we didn't talk about was systems really in this conversation, and what does a system look like to a community, or what is that system? And then there's loads of stuff in the chat. I mean, I think that point that Nick raised about we can be shit to one another. So how do we incorporate that into the work? I think is a really, really important point that we can't lose. You might want to phrase it differently. And then the other bit that we've also not talked about, but I see that Bill Walker's got loads of stuff on what can we learn from other countries. I think also is really important, because it feels like we're messing about with stuff that people are really expert in elsewhere.
Really interesting reflections.
Yeah, I just would like to add on to that, just about the fact that I feel there's a huge amount of learning from countries who haven't had the financial interventions that we've had over the last like 50 years. And I think to learn from a global majority would be a really great way to start to explore what happens in this country. So not just humility, but just like a real act of who's doing really good work and why, and I think that would really help. And I think also, like Matt said about systems, because there are systems. Yeah, there's not like no systems, or sometimes we get a bit and how does that work? What basic systems do people need to live well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. John, would you like to offer some reflections?
Yeah, I'll be quick as well. I've already shamelessly put a plug for a conference we've got coming up in the chat. I'll put in one more time before we close. But one of the things in that conference that I'm preparing for just now is saying, look, we kind of have to live up to the fact that a lot of our plans have really gone wrong a little bit along the way. And it's all about trying to share those lessons. You know, we've banged our heads against these walls. You don't have to. And trying to get to the bottom of it. And I actually think the discussion today has helped me think, yeah, well, no wonder it's so flipping hard for the staff who I'm asking to do all this, because it's not that what we've said is, you know, you used to have a metric for how many people were in your waiting list and how many people you provided support services to, and now you don't. That's the like where HLS, you'd be like, oh, what a joy to do HLS instead. We could just do learning cycle instead. Instead, I'm being like, no, you need to do all this stuff that keeps the funders happy. You need to do the HLS bit, but also communities. Oh, that's a whole interesting but nightmarish area in itself. And people are getting torn in that team between these different priorities. It's really hard for them. And at time, that's very hard for staff in general, it's worth saying, particularly in the third sector, just because of pay and things. Like, it's a lot to ask of people. And I feel like reflecting just today on this kind of different topic, if you see what I mean, it helps me like, yeah, like, no wonder these things are so hard, if you see what I mean. You know, no wonder 10 years on from Marmot, we're not what I call a Marmoty society. 10 years on from Christie in Scotland, which is terribly important for Scottish people. We're nowhere closer to Christie Commission principles. So kind of no wonder, you know, but there are lessons we can pick out. And I think a lot of it's about the fact that communities have a role in deliberating, being helped to deliberate. And that's why I don't like participatory budgeting much, because it's more like a referendum sort of approach. I think there's a lot here about saying, let's deliberate it, and then maybe we could rein in the community members who are going off and doing their own thing. Let's make it so we're a forum for that kind of work, because that does treat people like humans, and it says you as a group need to go through a lot of learning, because everyone needs to learn. You need to have a whole awareness of a system you're not aware of yet, community members. So I think there's a lot to learn from the global south, as people are saying, and elsewhere, about deliberative democracy, but at a really local level.
Absolutely. Brilliant. And thank you very much to everyone who's been reflecting in the chat. I've been really enjoying reading everything that folks have been sharing, and look forward to continuing the conversation at different events and in other places. Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Ruth, Matt, Karen and John for such a stimulating and vibrant discussion. And thank you again to everyone who's contributed and shared resources in the chat. We will collate all of the resources that you shared, and we'll make sure that they are available along with the transcript and the recording from this session, which should be available within the next couple of weeks. Before you all dash off to your very busy days, we have a very brief feedback survey, which we'd really appreciate you taking the time to complete. If this is your only session of the week, or perhaps your last one, if you're able to kind of complete that now, that would mean a lot to us. We have a whole range of other sessions taking place over the week, and there's one starting in about 10 minutes actually, which focuses on equity, which you might be interested in, which picks up on some of the themes we've started to discuss today. So we will pop the link to our schedule in the chat, and you can have a look if there are others you'd love to sign up to. So finally, just before you all go, I'd like to invite you all to unmute and give our contributors and yourselves a huge round of applause. Thank you very much, everyone, and take care.